Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Last week, I said to you all that I thought that we had reached the pinnacle of controversy in British politics by examining Tony Blair. So for this week, I decided to focus on the only character that might be able to prize that title away from Mr. Blair. Margaret Thatcher served as UK Prime Minister between 1979 and 1990, making her the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. Coming to power as the first female Prime Minister, Thatcher promised to end the high inflation of the 1970s and curb the power of the trade unions. Through her second and third terms in office, her premiership became defined by considerable liberalisation and privatisation of the UK economy, in many ways conceiving the North American style of capitalism that Britain still has today. Despite winning 3 elections in a row, Mrs. Thatcher had, and still has, a large number of detractors. Her modern image, however, is so polarised that today's perceptions of her are almost completely worthless in assessing her real effect on the country. Whilst many on the left loathe Thatcher, and Thatcherism, the right have deified her, and seem to have created an image of her as a dogmatic ideologue who would never give in to her opponents on any issue. As I discussed with my guest today, however, Thatcher's record on some issues, such as slimming down the welfare state and Britain's relationship with the European Union, was not noticeably conservative, and does not conform at all with the right-wing portrayal of Thatcher as a woman not and never for compromising. The problem with this claim of dogmatism where it isn't always warranted is conservatives today, many of whom do not actually remember the Thatcher period, hold their leaders to the false standard of Thatcher, the great ideologue. There was great discontentment within the Conservative Party over David Cameron and Theresa May for many reasons, but one reason certainly was that many considered them overly centrist and soft. I now see more and more Conservatives saying the same thing about Boris Johnson, with some readying themselves for a leadership election in which they plan to replace him with somebody more ideologically pure. This tendency to look for somebody uncompromising in their views, I would argue, is the result of a mistaken reading of Thatcher. What's more, it is a very bad way for the governing party of the country to operate, binning leaders after 2 or 3 years when the members become disappointed by their lack of right-wing achievements, as is the case with Scott Morrison's Liberal Party in Australia. Here with me to discuss Thatcher's complicated and bizarre legacy is Lord Peter Lilley. Peter served as Member of Parliament for St Albans, Hitchin and Harpenden between 1983 and 2017, and served as a minister under both Margaret Thatcher and her successor John Major. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Margaret Thatcher. Good morning, Peter. It's good to see you. How are you?
I'm well. Good to see you.
This podcast covers leaders whose legacies are contested. I can't think of a politician in British history whose legacy is more contested than Margaret Thatcher. She stirs such dislike amongst so many people in Britain still today. Obviously, being disliked and being controversial are not exactly the same thing. Mrs. Thatcher has many fans as well, mostly within your party, Peter, the Conservatives. You served in her government. Do you understand why so many people didn't like her when she was Prime Minister and still don't like her now?
I sort of understand, or I can understand some reasons, though I think it was partly that people attributed the difficulties we went through to her as if they were deliberate, and yet, nobody deliberately creates unemployment or deliberately destroys businesses. That happened, but it happened because it was the only way out of the problems that came before. Effectively, it was like going cold turkey after being on drugs. And I know that people who've been through that say that they feel very resentful for those who've made them go through cold turkey. Others say they're very grateful that they got out of it. So I think that's the main reason, coupled with which the fact that she was so successful obviously upset her opponents. Successful in getting re-elected, and despite the fact that they assumed, because in the milieu in which left-wing intellectuals live, everybody agrees with them, and they just can't imagine that there's a world outside where the largest proportion of the population voted for her and kept voting for her.
Okay, some interesting ideas there. She was born in Grantham in Lincolnshire in 1925. The image of her as the daughter of a greengrocer became a cliche, really, in how she's been remembered, because it was seen later, I think, as keeping her in touch with small business and with private enterprise, which became a large part of her appeal, and it was something that other Conservatives, the Etonian set, perhaps lacked, a sort of common touch. What do you think sparked her interest in politics? Why do you think she went into politics?
Her father, of course, was involved in local politics. I think he became an alderman in Grantchester, which means he must have been a councillor, I suspect, beforehand. So she would have heard people talking around the kitchen table about politics from her earliest age. But in those days it would be unusual for a woman to realise that she could be involved in politics. Yet she did get that view because I think her father treated her as an intellectual equal the whole time. So he'd argue with her and she'd argue with him, rather than him saying, "Don't worry your pretty little head about this sort of thing." That gave her the start. Then she got involved with the Conservatives in university. Now, why did she want to devote herself to that rather than being a physicist or a lawyer? A chemist, wasn't she, or a lawyer? It's hard to say. I can't even really say why it's true of myself, so how can I see inside someone else's brain? I've just always been interested in politics, and I rationalise it that I think it's probably what such talents as I've been given suit me for, and I suppose she may have come to the same conclusion.
Fair enough. She studied chemistry, as you said, at the University of Oxford after the Second World War. She said later that she was prouder of having been the first Prime Minister with a science degree. She was prouder of that than having been the first woman Prime Minister. She found it fairly unremarkable that she was a woman in politics. And she encouraged other women not to kind of whine about their lot in life. Of course, she had married an older and quite wealthy man in Dennis Thatcher in 1951, which perhaps made it easier for her to be a politician, a woman in politics, than for other women. How would you characterise her marriage to Dennis Thatcher?
It was very ordinary in a way. I can remember when I was just a humble speechwriter, and before I ever became an MP, she would break off from writing speeches, and you'd hear her telephoning Dennis and saying, "Dennis, now remember there's some fish fingers in the fridge, and there's this and this for your dinner. I'm sorry I'm not back tonight," sort of thing. Like any working wife detained at work might say to her husband, who she realised, as all husbands are, as a sort of inferior being and unable to look after themselves without help from their wife. So she was very ordinary, but it was clearly very affectionate, and I think it was a tremendous blow to her later in life when she lost him. And she clearly relied on him for a sort of balance after away from the vicissitudes of politics, and he'd tell her to calm down and carry on.
Did he ever express any political opinions that you know of that were perhaps different to hers?
No. At the time, of course, he was the main feature in the Dear Bill letters in Private Eye, which everybody imagined were totally imaginary. I can remember, however, again, before I was an MP, going down to Chequers for some meeting with people in the research department. Mrs. Thatcher wasn't there yet, so Dennis looked after us, and we would express our opinions, and they were usually probably critical of the government, that it wasn't doing enough of this or enough of that. And he'd say, "Yes, that's a very good point. I must write to Bill about it," or I must mention it to Bill. but not self-mocking. I mean, clearly he did have some kind of exchanges with Bill, and it was clear that his ideas were, if you like, more conventionally right-wing than was the average of the population as a whole.
She became an MP in 1959, and she went on to serve in the Conservative government of Edward Heath. From 1970 until 1974, she was the Education Secretary. The Heath period is important, I think, because it sets up why she became Conservative leader. Heath's premiership is not regarded as having been a success. How did Margaret Thatcher and other Conservatives to the right of somebody like Edward Heath diagnose what had gone wrong?
The main thing was this sense of U-turns, that he'd set off on a path, there'd be uproar and complaints, and he'd reverse. And he ended up doing the precise opposite of what he had started off doing. He'd started off saying he was going to be Selsdon man, as it was called. I pursue a fairly a classical economic conservative approach, and ended up controlling every price, wage and dividend in the country, down to the tickets of the smallest charity. People thought, what's the point of a Conservative Party if you're going to be more controlling and totalitarian in economic sense than any socialist party had ever dared propose in our country? So there was this feeling of that he just hadn't had the guts to see it through, and it needed a strong woman to put it right.
She challenged Edward Heath for the leadership in 1975, and she won. She won the support of her parliamentary Conservative colleagues. When she became leader of the Tory party, she was the party was in opposition then. Do you think many people thought she could win a general election?
Certainly a lot of people didn't. They caricatured her as a woman with a shrill voice who wore hats and looked out of date. And they continued to caricature as that long after she'd given up wearing hats and had taken voice lessons and lowered her voice. So the caricature lived on. But I can remember talking to Conservative. I was seeking a parliamentary seat at the time, unsuccessfully. So I met lots and lots of Conservative associations, and a lot of them were terribly worried that this woman would never win us an election. So even among the Conservative faithful, there were those doubts. And it took more than one election victory to convince them that she was a winner.
Of course, she did win power in 1979. The Labour government, led by James Callaghan, had been contending with strikes and high inflation, and a feeling among many people that the country was in decline. And that perceived declinism was exploited very effectively by the Conservative campaign in 1979. I don't think you were an MP at this stage, Peter, but what are your memories of the 1979 election and the way that Thatcher conducted herself on that occasion?
Well, mine are somewhat hazy in that I was in the process of getting married, or I was about to get married. My wife was ill, so I had to go and visit her in hospital, and we had to postpone the wedding. So it was all, I'm afraid my memories were purely personal, other than that I was doing things in the research department, because I'd have to go and visit my wife at sort of 6 in the morning and then go and do things. But I really didn't have a clear idea of what was happening, and the result was more of a surprise to me than perhaps it would have been if I'd had my finger on the pulse at the time. But I can't remember being too worried. I was sort of sure we'd win, but probably only just. And a clear victory was something of surprise to me and to many others. We've
found ourselves over the last few months talking almost non-stop about the running of government, and especially the running of Number 10. How did Thatcher run her government and deal with her staff and her cabinet ministers?
The interesting thing about her was the less important you were, the nicer she was to you. And the more important you became, the more brutal she was to you. So, just an example, again, before I was elected, I was summoned in to write a speech or be involved in speech writing. She'd just come back from a trip to Mexico, hadn't slept for 3 days, which normally she could do without 2 days' sleep. 3 days' sleep left her tired and irritable. In her absence, Geoffrey Howe, who was present in the room at the meeting, had, I think, put up interest rates or done something which she didn't like. So she let off a great attack on him. Geoffrey, why are you doing this? And suddenly realised I was in the room. Turned to me and said, "Oh, Peter, you shouldn't have heard any of that." And then saw I was wearing a black tie and said, "Why are you wearing a black tie?" And I said, "Well, I've been to a funeral of an aunt relative in the morning." And she was immediately full of sort of maternal concern. Was I too distressed by this, and so on. And the difference between how she treated me and how she treated Geoffrey Howe was remarkable. And likewise, the West Indian guard outside her room loved her because she always remembered him and his family and his birthday and so on. Whereas a lot of her colleagues didn't have the same sort of feeling of receiving any empathy from her. So she was quite tough. That was exacerbated by her modus operandi, which was to challenge anything anyone said. So if a minister or anyone else, advisor, went to her and said, "I think we should be doing this, and this is policy we should pursue," even if it was one that instinctively appealed to her, she'd tear it apart. She'd look for every weakness, examine every problem. And most people would go away thinking, it's all true what they say, she doesn't listen, she's rude, she's arrogant, she thinks she knows best. Not realising that actually, if you've won the argument, she'd then adopt the policy. But she didn't perhaps have the graciousness to say, "Oh, Fred, you were absolutely right. Why didn't I realise that? I was wrong." She was just testing to destruction any argument, and if it survived, she'd adopt it. But she often left some people feeling bruised in the process.
Did you like her on a personal level? Forgetting, trying to put aside the working relationship for a second, did you enjoy her company?
Yes, I did, but I think I was always considered rather junior. First of all, just summoned in to help write speeches and write policy papers and presentation papers, and then I was an MP who knew her and was part of a group who was supportive of her, but junior, backbenchers. Then even when I got in the cabinet, I was, the youngest and most junior. Had I gone on to be someone more important, it might have been tougher, but she always treated me more like a young son rather than a fully fledged adult.
There's so much of note and of controversy to discuss in Thatcher's premiership that it can't really be covered in the time that we have. And I wanted to discuss things that Thatcher did that perhaps go against or contravene some of the principles of conservatism that you share, Peter, and that your party kind of outwardly, at least, or many people within your party share. And the two things I want to sort of highlight in the discussion are the welfare state and Thatcher's experience with the European Union and the common market. If we look at the welfare state first, you were the Secretary of State for Social Security in John Major's government, John Major, of course, having succeeded Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. Very simply, what is the conservative or right-leaning attitude towards the welfare state?
Well, it is or ought to be that anyone who can look after themselves and their families should, but that everybody who has either temporary or permanent difficulties should receive the help of the rest of us. So that's the sort of part of being a nation, a country. It is for the fortunate many to help the less fortunate few. In political terms, though, it was a feeling that the welfare state may have got out of control, may have been not helping people into work, but paying people not to work, as it were. But it was unwise to do anything about it. So that was the long-term approach of the Conservative Party, was just to sort of accept we got it, to live with it, and do nothing about it. And as a result, the welfare state, in terms of the social security system, grew twice as rapidly as the economy as a whole, and so was taking a constantly rising share of national income. And but post-Thatcher, was the first to try and tackle that and say it ought. In a prosperous society, people oughtn't to need welfare automatically. It ought to be something which should be focused on those in genuine need. So that was my instinct. Mrs. Thatcher's probably shared the same instinct, but as a precautionary approach said it's not for us to try and reform the welfare state. There are more important things to do. We've just got to live with the fact it may be too expensive, it may be badly targeted, but if we start reforming it, we'll get an additional layer of odium on top of all the other things we're having to do to the economy.
Yes, I mean, this is the interesting thing about the approach that she took. I mean, the sort of mantra of Thatcher and her Chancellor Geoffrey Howe, who you've already mentioned, regarding the state of the British economy, was essentially that inflation was a bigger problem than unemployment, and that for a kind of, in inverted commas, healthier economy, unemployment would have to increase a bit in order for inflation to be reduced. Do you think that her increasing of unemployment made the welfare state larger, even if that wasn't necessarily intentional? She contributed quite directly to something that instinctively she didn't like in terms of having a large welfare state.
Well, certainly for every possible reason, she would have wanted not to have high levels of unemployment and high levels of welfare payments as a result. It wasn't so much she deliberately created unemployment as there was no known way of reducing inflation without going through this process of cold turkey. But that was the consequence of the addiction to constantly fueling inflation by trying to solve unemployment by inflating your way out of it. And that had to stop eventually. To the extent she was involved in expanding the state in this area, it was in things like youth training scheme and putting David Young in charge to find ways of getting off benefit and into work, and encouraging people to get off benefit and into work. She was accused at the time of having deliberately encouraged people to go off unemployment benefit, because that showed you were then counted as unemployed and the unemployment figures were going up, and instead to rely on invalidity benefit. There was no attempt to do that. It's just that people found the way of getting onto invalidity benefit, having in addition to their any income support or unemployment pay, and that obviously put up the cost of unemployment because people were receiving two or more benefits, but it also alleviated the pain for those who were able to claim invalidity benefit.
Yes, and considerable pain it was, given that the extent of the unemployment and the fact that the unemployment that occurred in the 1980s was sort of concentrated in certain areas of the country, areas that had large manufacturing bases. It's quite interesting. I was looking at a piece of opinion polling research just before we started, and in spite of the fact that there's this kind of belief that the electorate moved to the right during the 1980s, more people had support for the welfare state by the end of the 1980s, by the end of the Thatcher premiership, than at the start. Her effect on that area of British politics and policy wasn't particularly conservative in the end, was it?
Well, no, I mean, the welfare state is something, there may be some sort of anarcho-capitalists who believe you cannot have a welfare state, but conservatives always believe that you've got to help those in greatest need. I mean, one of my small claims to fame was introducing the Disability Rights Bill to extend rights for disabled people. And when I took it to Cabinet, people said, "Oh, you're supposed to be a Thatcherite Conservative, sure, how can you be in favour of it?" And I said, well, that's why, those of us who are prosperous ought to be proud to be helping those who need help. What I don't want to do is help those who don't need help to remain, because it's usually bad for them that they remain out of the workforce, and the longer you remain out of the workforce, the more demoralised and incapacitated or disabled to find jobs you become. So people would caricature Thatcher and the Conservatives as being against the welfare state, and that wasn't the case at all. When I was a part-time worker in the research department, recruited by Mrs. Thatcher, and the only things she wanted me to work on was ways of trying to minimise unemployment.
It's quite interesting because you, in 1999, you gave quite an interesting speech that after the Conservatives had left office, where you talked about how the market could only do so much in providing for people. That speech coincided, I don't think you deliberately caused it to coincide with this, but it coincided with a party being held for the 20th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's coming to power. Did you intend... I'm just interested to hear what the sort of basis for that speech was. Did you intend for that speech to be a kind of direct attack on Thatcherism? Or did the press just latch on to what you said and kind of twisted it?
The latter. I didn't for an instant either intend to or dream of attaching Thatcherism. Indeed, I was trying to provide an intellectual basis for Mrs. Thatcher saying the health service is safe in our hands. Why is it safe in our hands when we're constantly, for 40 years we've been accused of wanting to privatise it, sell it off, return to the status quo before 1948. We never had and never would, but people hadn't really spelt out why. And the answer was that you cannot ration health by price. Even insurance systems don't ration health by price. So we should recognise that, and recognise that you can effectively ration different types of food are rationed by price and housing is rationed by price, but health can't be. You can't say to someone, "Oh, we'll only mend one of your lungs if you've got lung cancer because you're half as rich as someone else who can afford to have two lungs mended." It's just inconceivable. So I tried to spell that out. I didn't think it would be terribly contentious, but it so happened that both was principally the Times, and indeed the editor subsequently apologised to me. And he was a good friend of mine. He said, "Sorry, we did make a big fuss over it. We were really out to get William Hague at the time." I can't quite think why they wanted to get William Hague, but they were. What happened, I discovered the day I was due to deliver it, and I'd been asked to deliver this. It was called the Butler Memorial Lecture. Coincided with Mrs. Thatcher's party, which was extremely irritating, or, a party to celebrate 25 years of her leadership of the Conservative Party, I think it was. It meant I couldn't go to that, which was annoying, but also I thought, well, the speech will be dwarfed by that, so I released it 2 days early, so that it would be possibly get a bit of coverage before that event. Instead, people linked it and used it and ran it for about 10 days. I got more coverage for that speech than all the other speeches I've ever given put together, and it was all negative. Even though it was saying something. 10 years later, in fact, one of the journalists who'd been hammering it said, "Why don't you give a sort of follow-up of that speech about why the health service is safe in our hands?" I said, "If I did, it would be so boring. It wouldn't get a single inch of news coverage because everybody accepts that that's self-evidently true. I couldn't see why it appeared odd at the time, but it did." And the Conservative Party at the time was in a very feverish frame of mind, so that people who'd been consulted about the speech, who'd improved it, suddenly said to journalists, "Oh, I can't think why Lilley said this." Very odd.
Yes, I think probably the Tories' low ebb.
Yeah.
Possibly its lowest ebb. I want to discuss... I want to discuss Europe with you. You were quite a prominent Eurosceptic. I believe you voted Leave during the EU referendum in 2016. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do you think of Thatcher's record on Europe? I mean, I'd say there's quite a lot of rhetorical Euroscepticism in what she said, the Bruges speech and other such things, going after the EU budget and things like that. But she did advocate staying in the common market in 1975, which was the first time that we had a referendum on that topic. And she was pivotal in helping to create the single market in 1986. So it must be quite a mixed record for a Eurosceptic like yourself.
Not really, because I also voted to stay in 1975, but with some reservations. I was afraid from reading, I actually took trouble to read the Treaty of Rome, that it would lead to a federal state, but all my elders and betters said, "Don't worry about that. Of course they won't. They know that we'd never accept it, and the price of having us in is that it remains effectively a single market, and that'll be it." I was obviously gullible, but that was the initial view of free market conservatives. Well, here was removing tariff barriers between us and Europe. And a bit of cooperation on other matters, excellent, highly desirable. But as each sort of treaty of reform meant the centralization of powers in Europe that we didn't think were necessary for a single market to operate, people became more and more dubious, including Mrs. Thatcher. And she, certainly, and I, at that stage, would have thought, well, hopefully we can reform it from within. And eventually the view came that we couldn't reform it from within and had to leave. I suspect that had she been around in 2016, she would have voted, I'm very confident she would have voted to leave, though Charles Paul, who was very close to her on all these matters, maintains she wouldn't have done. So there are different views. But she clearly expressed her general approach in the Bruges speech. I was at the time junior Treasury Minister out in Cyprus at a meeting of the Commonwealth Treasury Ministers. And the speech was released. There was turmoil in all the chancelleries of the world as to what it all meant. All my fellow Commonwealth Treasury Ministers came in and to the meeting, before the meeting, and said, "What does this all mean, Peter? Explain to us." And I said, "Well, most of you should know. You've been through it yourselves. You got your independence a little while back. We're now trying to get ours." And my official said, "Oh, the minister didn't really mean to say that." But that was my instant reaction to it. I hadn't seen the speech before, and I had no briefing about it. But it was us trying to get back powers that we'd conceded to, as she used to refer, not that I ever heard her use the phrase, but she referred to us as being a a Belgian colony when she was being dismissive of the EU. And that was the sort of sentiment I was expressing to my Commonwealth colleagues.
It must be a bit of a bugbear for you, though, that all of these powers that were conceded were always conceded by your party.
True, mainly because we've been in power most of the time, from 78 onwards, 79 onwards. And the biggest accretion of powers probably was the Single Market Act, which came under Mrs. Thatcher and which had her support, mainly because of its name. I mean, she was, I think, somewhat bamboozled into it by Treasury Minister Lord, I forget his name, but he was quite clever in persuading her that it was all just about mutual recognition of qualifications and standards rather than centralisation, as it became, of standard setting. So I understand she became more sceptical about that, reluctant to admit that she'd been responsible for this process. But it showed how easy it was to be drawn in, and indeed, when it came to the next stage of should there be a monetary union, the fact that one of the clauses in the Single Market Act referred to, I think just its title contained the phrase monetary union, was used by pro-Europeans to say we had a legal commitment to move on to a monetary union, which I'm sure she didn't ever anticipate or intend.
Do you think Europe was the biggest contributing factor in her downfall?
It was the combination of the poll tax, so-called, the community charge we were told to call it, and the European issue. Had she not introduced the poll tax, she would have survived the European thing. But the animus of opposition from a large section of her cabinet and colleagues and parts of the media was driven by the European issue. So she'd have been strong enough to survive that if she hadn't undermined her support through the poll tax, which, many MPs thought they were going to lose their seats as a direct result of it. I personally was against that, as was Nigel Lawson, with whom I was closely associated.
She served for 11 years as Prime Minister, 11 and a half years. She never lost a general election, as you said. She won 3 times. What I've been trying to get at today, asking you these questions about welfare, the welfare state and Europe, is that I think a lot of people on the right have sort of deified Margaret Thatcher and have kind of turned her into an idol. But there are things about her legacy, especially in terms of, not really slimming down the welfare state, bringing Britain much further into the European project, that Conservatives instinctively probably wouldn't agree with. And I know that these things weren't necessarily intentional, but they do show that her legacy is much more complicated than people on both the right and the left of politics make it out to be. Do you think that that her effect on the Conservative Party in the years after she left Downing Street, that's to say, having such a kind of cultural stronghold over the party, do you think it hurt the Conservatives?
It's hard to believe that someone who won 3 elections and never lost an election was someone who alienated people. What clearly did occur was that we were in power for a long time. 12 years under her and another 6 under John Major. And there's a sort of rule of thumb that Western electorates, other than the Germans, turf out any leader after about 10 or 12 years. So because if you're in that time, you are accumulating resentments from difficult things you may have done. If you're successful, people will think success is normal and they can have a change. And, there's no great problem, but you don't want this lot because they've been around for a long time, they've done something that's annoyed you. You might as well give the others a chance, which is probably a good thing in a democracy. You don't want one party to be in power forever. Reluctant though one is to admit it when one's the power, that is the party that's going to have to concede power. So was that. But she'd effectively done her supreme triumph, which was to convert the Labour Party to Thatcherism. That Tony Blair was only elected because he promised he wouldn't undo the privatisations, the tax cuts, the reforms that she'd introduced. General public may or may not have thought she was a nice person, but they thought she was someone they should re-elect. And that they tended to think what she said was not a matter of ideology but common sense. I remember quite early on when Nigel Lawson was, I think he'd moved from the Treasury into the Cabinet, but the Public Broadcasting Service of America sent over a team to do a film showing the horrors of the Thatcher experiment, as those on the left called it. And they interviewed him because they thought he had a rather unattractive persona. He knew that was why they were interviewing him. And then they went off to South Wales to interview miners and steelworkers. And they came back afterwards, and we had a follow-up, and I was talking to them. They said the most extraordinary thing. We couldn't find anyone among the miners and steelworkers who liked Mrs. Thatcher, but nor could we find anyone who didn't add, but it had to be done. We had to get rid of these restrictive practices. Even the people who'd lost their jobs in the steel industry realised that something had to be done to make it more efficient, and likewise the coal mines. So people could just see that it was common sense. Only intellectuals thought there was something odd about it, or cruel about it. No one was cruel about it when as I say, actually, I was supposed to be trying to find ways of minimising the effect of disinflation on employment. But there was an inevitable, painful cost. Maybe with the benefit of hindsight, there were things we could have done and that I should have realised we could have done. I mean, I was only one of many. So I won't take all the blame myself for not having found the right answers, but I certainly didn't. But it certainly wasn't deliberate. And it just constantly amazes me that there are people who think that anybody in this world would deliberately want to create unemployment. But, that was the theme on the left and in the BBC and even in American public broadcasting.
What do you think could have been done to perhaps improve the ordeal of people who did come under hardship during the 1980s? Because, I know that you don't think it's deliberate, that sort of unemployment was a kind of deliberate act inflicted on these people by the government. But obviously, it's not much of a consolation to say to people who did get considerably poorer during the 1980s, oh, well, it had to be done. But the interesting thing is many of them themselves said it. But what could have been done, other than I think the mistake, if there was one, I'm not sure how avoidable it was allowing the simultaneous effect of North Sea oil coming on stream. First North Sea oil flowed in 1975, so it was beginning to come on stream in a large way just as Mr. Thatcher came to power, and the disinflationary measures to mean the pound went up to astronomical levels. Now, at the time, the presumption was that there was nothing you could or should do about that. Indeed, anything that you did to prevent the pound going up would have prolonged inflation and therefore prolonged the agony of getting out of inflation. Looking back and looking at experience elsewhere, I don't think that is necessarily the case. You can have disinflation without a sky-high exchange rate, and that would have made it less painful for some of our manufacturing industries. But that's the benefit of hindsight. I say that I did actually give a lecture in Washington about the impact of
oil on the exchange rate and sort of indicated it. I thought it was too high, but that was in my capacity in my day job. I was an energy analyst in my day job and only in my part-time working at research department. And I certainly didn't advise that we ought to hold the exchange rate down, but I think we can, and indeed I would be in favour now of a lower exchange rate.
What do you think Margaret Thatcher would think of Boris Johnson?
She'd find him, she'd have sort of mixed views. She was someone who was personally quite sort of puritanical Methodist in her private views about herself, but amazingly tolerant. If you remember, I was elected in '83, and shortly after the election, my next-door neighbour, Cecil Parkinson, got into all sorts of trouble and had to resign for lying to his wife, his mistress, and his mistress's father, and fathering a baby by her. It was the lying as much as the sexual incontinence or peccadillo. So she'd probably be tolerant of his tendency to have too many wives and girlfriends, and even too many babies. She'd find it more difficult to cope with the fact that he's not rigorous about accuracy, particularly over minor matters. But I think when it comes to honesty, well, she had, even with Cecil, she had him back in the cabinet as fast as she could. So I think she would be more tolerant of him than a lot of people imagine, given their sort of moral attitudes are miles apart. He's a libertarian and she's a tolerant Puritan.
Finally, obviously, by far the largest event in world history of my life so far has been the pandemic. Boris Johnson has come under considerable pressure from many different sides over how he's handled the coronavirus pandemic. What do you think Mrs. Thatcher's instinct would have been on things like lockdowns, if you had to guess where she would go on those sorts of things, given that many people on the sort of right of politics have taken umbrage at the imposition of these measures?
Well, I'm sure her initial approach would undoubtedly be the same as Boris's initial approach, was horror at the idea that we could lock people up in their houses and control every little aspect of their lives. But Mrs. Thatcher was, partly because she saw herself as a scientist, inclined to over-respect scientific advice. And she might well have done the same as Boris and said, oh, well, if you insist, we must do it, and if it is the only way of saving lives, it becomes a moral imperative that must be enshrined in law, but more than that, we must sort of condemn anyone who doesn't abide by these rules. I sort of hope she'd have been more critical, but my guess is she'd have followed much the same path as Boris.
The picture you've painted of her today is, and this gets back to what I mean about her legacy being quite an odd one and perhaps quite a misunderstood one, is of somebody that was a lot more pragmatic than she's remembered to be.
She was certainly very cautious. She did bold things, but only when she was thoroughly convinced that there was no alternative. That was one of her phrases, Tina, there is no alternative. So she'd do things when she was convinced they were right and necessary, but first of all she'd subject them to every kind of critique. Aren't there alternatives that are less problematic? And she also rationed herself. I was part of the No Turning Back group of new Conservative MPs in 83 onwards. And we went to her proposing reforms of various things, I think including the health service. And invited her to come, and she'd come and have dinner with us. She was very open in that way and discuss things. And her attitude was, look, I've got enough on my plate. You may well be right about what you're proposing, but I'm not going to take on more problems at a time than I can. I'm privatising these industries and doing other things. So she was very cautious. She didn't just plough in on a dogmatic basis, that's right, therefore must do it. She'd say, that may be right, but can we get it through and convince the people as well as all the other things we're doing? And at the end of the day, she was quite good at convincing the people and getting re-elected. Only Boris has got a higher majority than share of the electorate as a Conservative than she has. Which is why at the opening you said she's very unpopular, but some people support her. No, she was very popular, but some people opposed her. And that's why she got elected. Because she was popular.
But I think that her approval ratings today are extremely low. I think only Tony Blair has a lower approval rating of a prime minister.
That's interesting that the two most successful electorally have the two lowest. Well, that tells us that approval ratings retrospectively count for nothing.
Well, I saw the other day that Gordon Brown is now one of the most popular politicians in the country again.
That's interesting, isn't it?
So you may well be right.
Probably John Major too.
I should think so.
Maybe it's because people don't bother to attack unsuccessful ones after they've left, and they focus on those who are successful. In the case of the left, didn't like Tony Blair basically because he wasn't very left-wing, coupled with that, the Iraq War. People didn't like Mrs. Thatcher because she was successful and wasn't sympathetic to the intellectuals, though she considers herself to be a Tory intellectual.
Peter, that's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it.
Where can people find your work? You're a member of the House of Lords now, but is there anything that you would like to direct people towards whilst you're here?
Well, I still have a website, peterlilley.co.uk, which has all my old speeches, probably some of which I now regret, and some of my more recent ones. So if anyone's interested, there they would find them, and including some reminiscences about Mrs. Thatcher and some ideas about taking Thatcherism forward. But I think people would rightly be more interested in her views than mine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.